By mid-July 1944, the Allied armies in Normandy were bogged down in a grinding war of attrition. Since D-Day on June 6, progress inland from the beaches had been slow and costly. The German 7th Army, reinforced by elite panzer divisions, clung to every hedgerow, farmhouse, and village with desperate tenacity. The terrain of the bocage countryside, with its sunken lanes, thick hedges, and narrow fields, favored the defender. Tanks could barely maneuver, infantry had to fight yard by yard, and air support was often limited by the overgrown landscape. In the American sector west of St. Lo, repeated attempts to break through had faltered. Operation Cobra was conceived as the decisive push to rupture German lines and open the road to Brittany and the Loire Valley. The plan, developed by 1st Army Commander General Omar Bradley, aimed to smash a narrow front with overwhelming aerial bombardment, followed by a concentrated ground assault. Once a breach was made, General George S. Patton's newly arrived 3rd Army would pour through, driving deep into occupied France. German intelligence recognized the danger, but Hitler's orders forbade any significant withdrawal. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge's forces were stretched thin, but still capable of fierce resistance. The Americans needed not just a victory, but a breakthrough. As the final planning took shape, Allied commanders understood that Operation Cobra had to succeed quickly. The longer the front stayed static, the more time German reserves had to regroup. The Luftwaffe was weak in Normandy, but artillery and mortar fire still inflicted heavy casualties on advancing Allied units. This was not going to be an easy fight. Even with massive firepower, the Germans would not simply give way. But if Cobra worked, it could transform the campaign in France. Bradley's concept relied on speed, concentration, and the shock of overwhelming force, breaking the enemies well before they could recover. Before we begin the detailed story of how the Americans broke free from Normandy's deadly hedgerows, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with other history enthusiasts. Your support helps us keep bringing you detailed, in-depth documentaries on the pivotal battles and operations that shaped our world. With the plan in place, Allied bombers fueled and ready, and Patton preparing his armor for a decisive dash into the French interior, all that remained was to wait for the weather to clear. On July 24, 1944, the first attempt to launch Cobra would begin, but even before the operation truly started, tragedy would strike. The morning of July 24, 1944 dawned under heavy cloud cover, threatening the precision of the planned aerial bombardment that would initiate Operation Cobra. The Allies had assembled an unprecedented concentration of air power for a tactical operation, nearly 3,000 heavy bombers, hundreds of medium bombers, and close air support aircraft. The plan called for a carpet of bombs to obliterate a narrow sector of German defenses west of St. Lo, directly in front of 7 Corps under General J. Lawton Collins. But poor visibility led to a catastrophic mistake. As the bombers approached the target, confusion in alignment caused some formations to release their loads short of the designated zone, directly onto American positions. Hundreds of men were killed or wounded before the attack even struck the enemy. This tragic incident shook morale, but Bradley insisted that the operation go ahead. The bombing was postponed for 24 hours to regroup. At 9:38 on July 25, under clear skies, the bombardment began anew. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators roared overhead, dropping thousands of tons of explosives in a rectangle barely 2 kilometers deep. The concussion flattened hedgerows, pulverized German strongpoints, and churned the bocage into a wasteland. Medium bombers and fighter bombers followed, targeting roads, supply dumps, and retreat routes. The Germans in the sector, primarily the battered remnants of Panzerlehr Division, were stunned, many buried alive in their dugouts. When the dust began to settle, Collins ordered the ground assault forward. The 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions advanced cautiously, clearing surviving pockets of resistance. Even in their shattered state, German units fought with grim determination. Snipers, machine gun nests, and the occasional tank delayed progress. Still, by midday, 7 Corps had advanced over a mile in some places, a significant gain after weeks of stalemate. Yet the breakthrough was not immediate. The destruction caused by the bombing also created obstacles for the attackers. Craters, shattered roads, and debris slowed the movement of tanks and vehicles. German artillery, though weakened, continued to shell advancing troops. Patience was essential. Cobra would not be won in a single day. On the German side, Field Marshal von Kluge quickly realized the scale of the crisis. Panzerlehr was effectively destroyed as a fighting formation, but local commanders scrambled to form ad hoc defensive lines. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs meant that reserves would be thrown into the maelstrom rather than withdrawn to safety. As the sun set on July 25, Cobra had opened a wound in the German front, but it was not yet a gaping hole. The Americans had secured a lodgment for further exploitation, and Patton's armor was poised for its long-awaited dash. The decisive moment was approaching, and it would come in the days ahead as mobility returned to the Normandy battlefield for the first time since D-Day. By July 26, 1944, the breaches created by Operation Cobra were widening. While infantry divisions continued to clear pockets of German resistance near St. Lo, American armored units began filtering through the gap. Lieutenant General George S. Patton's newly activated Third Army was preparing to unleash its strength. Patton had waited impatiently since D-Day for his chance to maneuver in open country. Now, with the German front buckling, his opportunity had arrived. 7 Corps' progress on the 26th was steady but not spectacular. German rearguard still held isolated hedgerow positions, using small anti-tank teams and machine gun fire to delay the advance. However, Panzer Lehr Division was effectively finished as a coherent fighting force, its armored strength reduced to a handful of operational vehicles. Allied artillery and air power harried every movement the Germans attempted. On July 27, American forces pushed deeper toward Coutances. The road network, though cratered and choked with wreckage, was opening up as engineers cleared routes for the armored columns. German commanders, von Kluge and Hauser, faced an impossible dilemma: withdraw and risk collapse, or stand and risk encirclement. Hitler's orders allowed for no voluntary retreat. The result was predictable: formations were committed piecemeal and destroyed. By July 28, the German defensive line began to unravel completely. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions punched southward, exploiting the widening corridor. Patton's forward elements moved rapidly, bypassing centers of resistance and leaving mopping up operations to the infantry. Allied fighter bombers ranged freely over the battlefield, strafing and bombing any German columns attempting to reposition. July 29 marked a turning point. Coutances fell to the Americans, opening the road to Avranches, the key to Brittany and the entire western flank of German forces in France. Patton, seeing the chance to accelerate, pressed his corps commanders to keep moving regardless of logistical strain. The momentum was building. The Germans were now in danger of losing not just ground, but entire formations. By July 30, the breakthrough was no longer a matter of contention. German units, including elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, were streaming south in disorder, harried by airstrikes and artillery. Communications broke down as Allied forces overran command posts. The speed of the advance forced the Germans into reactive defense, a battle rhythm they could not sustain. On July 31, American spearheads reached Avranches. This was the decisive moment Patton had anticipated. The capture of the town and its bridges over the Sea and Saloon rivers opened the gateway into Brittany and, more importantly, the rear of the German 7th Army. The breakout from Normandy was achieved. Yet, success brought new challenges. Patton's forces were now operating in open terrain, where mobility favored them but also stretched their supply lines. Fuel, ammunition, and maintenance would become as critical as firepower in the weeks ahead. Still, the strategic door was open, and Patton was determined to drive through it before the enemy could recover. On August 1, 1944, the U.S. Third Army officially became operational under Lieutenant General George S. Patton. This was no ordinary activation. It marked the transition from a grinding attritional battle in the bocage to a war of movement. Patton, a master of rapid maneuver, intended to capitalize immediately on the breach created by Operation Cobra. His Corps, 8, 15, and XX, poured through the Avranches Gap in a continuous stream of armor, trucks, and mechanized infantry. The Germans, reeling from the collapse of their front, attempted to stabilize the situation. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge still clung to the hope of forming a defensive line along the Sea River, but by August 2 that hope had vanished. American columns bypassed resistance points, leaving them for follow-on units. Patton's orders were clear: keep moving, seize bridges intact, and prevent the enemy from regrouping. By August 3, 8 Corps was already pushing west toward the Breton Peninsula. Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire, all major German-held ports, became objectives. The Germans had fortified these cities heavily, but Patton's goal was not immediate capture, it was isolation. If these strongholds could be cut off quickly, their garrisons would be rendered strategically useless. Meanwhile, 15 Corps turned east and northeast, threatening the flank of the retreating German 7th Army. The rapid advance forced the Germans into a defensive scramble. The Luftwaffe, virtually absent over Normandy in July, attempted sporadic sorties, but Allied air superiority remained overwhelming. Fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force continued to hammer road junctions, rail lines, and fleeing columns. On August 4, Patton ordered his units to fan out aggressively. The landscape had shifted from hedgerow country to rolling open terrain, perfect ground for American armor. Sherman tanks and half-tracks moved in long columns, bypassing towns where German rearguard still lingered. Local French resistance fighters played an increasingly vital role, providing intelligence on German movements, sabotaging supply lines, and guiding U.S. patrols through unfamiliar territory. By August 5, 8 Corps had reached the approaches to Brest. German defenses were formidable, but Patton's orders were to contain, not storm the city immediately. Instead, his forces moved swiftly to encircle it while reconnaissance units probed toward Lorient. The aim was to trap the port garrisons before they could be reinforced or evacuated. On August 6, German high command began to realize the magnitude of the disaster. Hitler's insistence on holding Brittany and launching counterattacks from the Mortain area was already in motion, but these plans were being outpaced by Patton's advance. The Americans had seized the initiative entirely. By August 7, the front line stretched deep into Brittany, with multiple German garrisons isolated. Patton's mobility, coupled with relentless Allied air support, had transformed the battlefield. The Germans were now facing a war of encirclement, and the trap would soon snap shut. On the night of August 6 to 7, 1944, Adolf Hitler issued direct orders for an immediate counterattack to cut off the American spearhead at Avranches. This operation, codenamed Luttich, was to be carried out despite strong opposition from several German field commanders. The goal was audacious and unrealistic. For depleted panzer divisions, including the 2nd SS Das Reich and 116th Panzer, were tasked with striking west from the Mortain area toward the coast, severing Patton's lifeline. At dawn on August 7, thick morning fog provided temporary concealment as German tanks and infantry began their push. They achieved initial gains, overrunning several outposts and threatening to reach the vital road junctions. However, by late morning, the fog lifted, and Allied air power descended with devastating effect. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force pounded advancing panzers in relentless waves. German columns, strung out on narrow roads, were shredded from above. While the Germans struggled at Mortain, Patton continued his sweeping advance deeper into Brittany and eastward toward Le Mans. The counterattack had the unintended effect of leaving their eastern flank dangerously exposed. General Omar Bradley, recognizing the opportunity, ordered a pincer movement to trap the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in what would become the Falaise Pocket. From August 8 to 12, Canadian and British forces pushed south from toward Falaise, while Patton's 15 Corps moved north from Argenton. The closing jaws of the encirclement began to take shape. Resistance was fierce, the Germans understood the stakes. Every available unit, from Waffen-SS to Luftwaffe field divisions, was thrown into desperate holding actions to keep the escape corridor open. By August 13 to 16, the corridor had narrowed dramatically. Artillery barrages, tank engagements, and close-quarter fighting erupted along the shrinking gap. Patton's forces pushed relentlessly, capturing Alassa and cutting key supply routes. The German retreat degenerated into chaos, units intermixed, command structures collapsed, and fuel shortages left vehicles abandoned along the roadside. On August 17 to 19, the Allies tightened the noose. The gap at Chambois was now only a few kilometers wide. Canadian, Polish, and American troops fought to seal it completely, facing fanatical German counterattacks aimed at keeping an escape route open. The Luftwaffe made rare appearances, but Allied fighters dominated the skies. By August 21, the Falaise Pocket was closed. An estimated 50,000 Germans were captured, while tens of thousands more lay dead or wounded. The battlefield was a scene of devastation, fields littered with wrecked vehicles, burnt-out tanks, and unburied dead. The remnants of the German forces in Normandy had been shattered. Operation Cobra had achieved far more than its initial objective. The German position in France was irreparably broken. Patton's exploitation had transformed a breakthrough into a decisive encirclement, paving the way for the liberation of Paris and the eventual drive into Germany itself.